welcome back to the Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here. Happy to be back. It's been a while. A lot of water under the bridge, actually. I've moved to Park City, Utah, living up in Deer Valley, 8,400 feet elevation. I'm higher than Machu Picchu. And man, loving it. Loving it. It's been a wonderful life upgrade. If you haven't seen my Facebook or Instagram posts, they've gotten interesting because I live in an interesting place with lots of nature and mountain lions and moose and you name it. So a lot happening. I got a series called Gateway to Health coming soon. It's going to be early next year. So this is October 2019 when I'm recording this. So I think around March, we're going to release that. It has to do with the mouth and its intimate role with all the diseases that we're finding in the body. Fascinating stuff. I've roped my wife into helping with that because she's a dentist. We have a series called Exhausted, Chronic Energy, Low Energy Fatigue. Almost done filming. We got a series on healing trauma, all kinds of trauma from PTSD to childhood trauma. It's been fascinating. It's been tear-jerking. That one's coming August of next year. And then the following year, we have one on parenting, conscious parenting and the likes. And then I'm doing the film with Robert Kiyosaki. Got another one I'm doing that's going to be more Urban Monk branded. More to come on that. I've got books on the new series coming. I may have a new book from the Urban Monk on the Life Garden, and a course on pet health, a course on raising healthy kids, and lots of good stuff. We're going to be doing some work with the podcast. Just a little refresh on the sound and the look and all that. It's been a while. I miss doing it, so I'm back. The podcast will stay audio just because it's way easier to do that with guests. And then I'll save my video for GoPros and action shots and skiing and biking and hiking adventures that are coming. Once in a while, if I could do a podcast on video, I will. But it's harder to get all that to happen. And so I'd rather just get quality content and bring it to you. Family's doing great. Kids are biking and soon to be skiing. Everything on my end is wonderful. And I'm looking forward to sharing all sorts of goodness with you. And lots going on with the companies. Got my supplement line, got a clothing line coming. And my role has been to really kind of pull back a little bit, read more, write more, hike more, and, measure thrice, cut once. And so lots of good stuff coming. I've opened up space to be able to podcast again. Got an amazing lineup coming your way in the next few months. Team is working on getting all that. This one is one that was left in the can. Somehow I did it last year and team missed it. And so Amy Stanton, a wonderful subject. I'm so sad that this thing got missed, and I'm going to release it now because it's an important subject, has to do with femininity and what it means to be a woman in our world. And she's a leading voice in that. And, again, I don't know how this one got stuck inside, but you know what? It's a wonderful, wonderful podcast that I'm happy to release now, better late than never. And the team is working on getting the show back on the road. So enjoy this podcast with Amy Stanton, and I will see you soon. Hello, and welcome back to the Urban Monk, Dr. Pedram Shojai. It's been a while. I miss doing this. I used to podcast a lot more, obviously. And then I got really busy in the movie business. And so we just did a relaunch of Interconnected. And I have some time to relax into this thing called podcasting. And that's how I see it, is podcasting is casual conversations with people that are interesting. You guys don't need any more lectures in your life. So I am very excited about the person I have here. She's a friend of mine who's done some great work. And she's really tackling this huge concept of kind of equal rights and feminism and what it means to be a woman and finding parity in the world that we live in, especially in our current climate that we live in. And it's opened up a lot of dialogue, and that's what we're here for. So Amy Stanton, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Pedram. I always love speaking with you, so this is a huge treat.
This is fun. This is fun. So you wrote a book, you crazy thing, you. People who write books are somewhat insane because it's a lot of work, but it was an important enough subject for you to say, we got to talk about this. So what is it? What are you talking about?
Well, it's called The Feminine Revolution. And what I realized about 5 years ago, and this is really when I started thinking about it, which just goes to show that either it took me a while to get the show on the road or it just takes a while to make something like this happen, or both. But I really was having my own experience of feeling an imbalance. But we talk a lot about work-life balance. This was a different kind of imbalance, and feeling like I developed this work persona, sometimes tough, assertive, direct as needed. But in some ways, those qualities had overshadowed and maybe even knocked out some of these other qualities: my sensitivity, my emotionality, the vulnerability, the fact that I cry easily. And those are traditionally considered feminine qualities. And I was starting to wonder why I was holding those qualities back and thinking maybe that wasn't serving me. And in fact, wondering if maybe that's why I had not met Prince Charming, because I was bringing bossy Amy into my personal relationships. And so I began to explore the topic and talk to a lot of different women about it, and men for that matter, because lots of men are holding back their feminine qualities as well. Or feel that that's necessary, honestly. But interestingly, I feel like there have been more conversations for men around the importance of showing your sensitivity and your vulnerability than there have been for women. And so a lot of the women I spoke to had similar experiences where they felt like they weren't really showing up as their full, authentic selves because they couldn't. And, I started my career in advertising in big agencies in New York City, where I certainly was told more than once not to be so sensitive and that crying wasn't appropriate. I mean, I don't think I needed to be told that, although I am a crier. So inevitably that would occasionally happen. And so I toughened up. I built this shell, this armor, because I felt like it was needed to, quote unquote, thrive in a man's world. And so all of that sort of sets the stage for this conversation. There have been so many important conversations around feminism, equal rights, equal opportunity, female empowerment. And I'm part of a lot of those conversations, but this is a totally unique conversation around femininity. And we basically in the book take 21 historically considered feminine qualities, show why they've been perceived as feminine, why they've been perceived as weak, and then we turn those qualities on their head and show that there are superpowers, that our sensitivity is part of what makes us so great and powerful in our work. Not, in fact, quite the opposite of a weakness, that it's actually okay to cry openly. And, that's one that I think always requires a little bit of explanation. But truthfully, when you start to dig deep and look at all the ways we as women have been labeled as feminine and not so positive ways, there's a stigma attached to it that we are breaking down and saying, let's take a closer look. For each and every one of us, our definition of femininity would be totally unique. Each of us is a balance of masculinity and femininity, and that's a good thing. But in order for us to look even on a broader level, broader scale at how we individually and societally define power, and potentially look at a new version of that definition, we need to start to unhinge some of these issues around the feminine and feminine qualities, because I think if there's ever been a time where we could agree that there's room for a new way of doing things, a new model for power, it's now.
Amen. So I know that when you first came up, and just FYI, Amy's very successful at what she does. She's a great publicist and all that. So she's winning in that game. But there's a reason why we're having this conversation, because there's this challenge, right, with allowing yourself to be yourself, or whatever that is. And I'm curious as to where that perception comes from. Do you feel like the men in the business world around you are kind of perpetrators and are perpetuating that, or do you feel like it's almost like become ingrained in the female operating system as this is how the world works and I just didn't think to question it? Somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. Because the reality is, again, these perceived definitions of femininity and these feminine qualities are deeply ingrained. They have been for millennia. My writing partner, Catherine Connors, who was a former academic and taught women's studies, was able to shed light on a lot of historical, philosophical, social anecdotes that really tell the story of why these are so deeply ingrained. And, based on my own personal experience, I'd say it's not only the men, but the men and women around me as I was essentially growing up in the workplace that were modeling certain ways of leading and just operating on a day-to-day basis and essentially determining what was appropriate. So that was presumed to be what was right. And it makes sense. Clearly it makes sense that we would think that the way to lead is to model yourself in a more masculine way after masculine leaders, because historically all the leaders were masculine. All the leaders were male. So it's now a different time because we're saying even the male leaders are able to start to integrate some of these, again, traditionally considered feminine qualities in a way that makes them their most powerful. Across the board, we would say we are our best if we are able to really tap into our masculine and feminine qualities when each of these things are appropriate. I'm still completely clear on how valuable that my directness and in some cases my assertiveness is in my work. I need those things, but I'm more aware than ever that it's my sensitivity and my emotionality and the fact that I am comfortable really showing myself to my team, my clients, et cetera. That's what really makes me the best at my job. It's the combination of those things.
Mm.
So, and the truth is we all feel better if we show up as ourselves. We're obviously going to be the most confident if we are able to show ourselves, and we're not trying to play a game or fake it. That's just goes, I guess, in some ways without saying, but I'll say it.
No one's going to show themselves if they don't feel safe showing themselves, right? And
Exactly.
and that's really the issue. I remember we were on a camping trip not too long ago at a lake. There's a bunch of guys jumping off a rock into the water, and the first guy that was going to go, they didn't know how deep it was, and so this guy's like, trying to do it, and all the other guys are like, "Come on, just jump! Don't be I'm sorry for the language. Don't be a pussy." And I'm standing there going, "Stop! You don't know how deep that water is, you idiot!" And so it was this thing where we
Mm-hmm.
just started deconstructing what was happening there. And I'm like, so you're telling me that because this idiot isn't going to check first and jump without any rhyme or reason or rationality, you are calling him something that has a feminine quality. Therefore, to be
Mm.
brave and callous and idiotic is a masculine quality, which is beneficial. It's just like, and these guys, they seem like nice boys, right? But it
Mm-hmm.
was built into their lexicon. It was built into, what courage means, right? And some of the most courageous people I've ever met have been women, right?
Hmm.
So is that actual courage? Like, what is that? And it's so pervasive. It's in everything you see in our culture. And unless you like kind of unturn that stone, you don't even realize it's there in a lot of the cases.
It is so true. And that was one of the things that was so fascinating about the process because Catherine and I, when we sat down to outline these 21 qualities, first of all, there could have been far more than 21, but the 21 were clearly able to be linked to, again, historical references and a very deep history around being attached to the feminine in a negative way. These were going head
Mm.
on against these stereotypes. And you start to realize how it happens so constantly and also unconsciously we're using these words. So, don't be so mothering, don't be so controlling. The don't be so sensitive one is a constant, even from a young age. I thought it was a personal one because from a young age, my mom would say, stop being so sensitive. And then again, it was reinforced in the workplace. And I really started to just assume that was the way of the world, that I really believed it. I believed my sensitivity was a problem. And again, only now can I see that it's my sensitivity that is picking up real information, and that it's my sensitivity that allows me to sit in a client meeting and understand what's being said between the lines, or my sensitivity allows me to pick up on the fact that one of my employees isn't quite right today and I need to get to the bottom of that and help her. Or my sensitivity allows me in personal relationships to really feel how someone's experiencing something so that I can be a rock for them or help them solve it. And so suddenly it really reframes things when you dig deeper. And we did that again with all 21 of these in a way that was so enlightening, because again, we take certain things for granted. We think certain things are the way they are and that there's no way around it. I mean, one of my friends, and it's been such an interesting journey as people around me have been reading the book. And I'm sure, of course, more people are complimentary to me than if they didn't have anything nice to say, they probably wouldn't say it, which, to a degree I'm okay with. But I feel like one of my friends who read it wasn't entirely, I think without saying it, she wasn't sure exactly what she was going to get from it. And there's a chapter called Be Mothering. And we're very clear from the beginning that's not about biological motherhood. We're talking about that nurturing mothering that is often perceived as a negative thing, being too nosy or too much of a busybody or in everybody's business all the time. And so my friend Sandra said, you know what, when I read the book, this is what really resonated for me, because my whole life people have been giving me a hard time for being too mothering. And I've been embarrassed about it and felt like I'm too much for them, even though it comes naturally to me and it's instinctive and it's how I like to show up in the world. And now I'm recognizing all the good parts of it. And that frankly, if a few people give me a hard time about it, that's not that big a deal, because the good so outweighs the negative parts of it. And so that's been in many ways the fun part of this, because really each person that's read it has experienced it in their own way and has been able to identify with things and sort of explore things that really they weren't even aware of. And I've been doing a lot of speaking lately, and especially in the corporate talks where these conversations are never really a part of their workday, it's been pretty powerful. And I've literally had lines of women standing there saying, I just had never thought about things this way. This is exactly what I needed to hear right now. Women crying, feeling like this just opens up a whole new way of accepting yourself. And we're not saying, I mean, the corporate thing's interesting because, of course, a lot of the places I've been speaking are huge corporations where culturally certain things are ingrained. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of room for more sensitivity or emotionality. And people have been given a hard time for those qualities. So they say, how do I integrate this if it's not welcome in the culture? And it's really not about kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and tomorrow showing up as this radically different feminine version of yourself. It's about starting to think about these things differently, figuring out where maybe we're holding some things back, and in a nuanced way, starting to unleash them and starting to experiment with them and play with them and seeing if in fact they can be powerful and they can be integrated. And frankly, if we don't model these things for each other and for our coworkers and even our bosses or employees, then they'll never change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, they're not really incentivized to change right now. Status quo has got a lot of inertia, right? So, I mean, what kind of pushback are you getting from the dudes, right? Like, do guys feel threatened by this conversation, or are they also coming to you saying, this is refreshing, thank you?
Well, it's funny because I actually think that the response I've received more than anything from the men is, I need you to write this exact same book for men. Why is this so tailored to women? Because it's the same conversation that we need. And the truth is, as I mentioned from the beginning, we feel this is just as important for the men because we want for men and women to feel liberated to express these parts of themselves. There's an interesting conversation going on right now, which you may be aware of, around toxic masculinity, because that's, to me, the most interesting, in some ways, what I call pushback that I've experienced. So I did this interview on an outlet called Now This. Are you familiar with Now This?
Yeah.
So in this particular case, it's direct to camera, and it started on Now This Women and then was elevated to the broader platform. But I was really speaking to camera and emphatically encouraging young women to be sensitive, show your emotional side, feel like you can actually show up as you are. That's the tone of it, and giving specific examples. And so the way they cut the piece, they opened with something I had said, which is, in a world where toxic masculinity, both in maybe at the heart of many of our biggest problems, powerful femininity, both in men and women, may be the solution. And what's interesting, I mean, obviously we all know you're not supposed to read the comments on things, but it was crazy to me. Like, the men went wild because it was not all the men, by the way. There were plenty of men who were completely on board, but there was a specific group of men that saw that as an attack on men, not on toxic masculinity. They can't even see the distinction between masculinity and toxic masculinity, which, by the way, I think is a huge problem. I felt that the things like bullying, for example, which have historically been classified as toxic masculinity, were universally perceived as bad things, but apparently no, or at least maybe there's not enough sophistication in the conversation. And then there was an ad that Gillette did. I don't know if you saw that, a Super Bowl ad specifically focused on toxic masculinity, and really the sort of end line was around, is this the best we can be? They showed a bunch of examples of bad behavior, and Gillette was essentially taking a stance for men showing up as their best selves. And I thought it was a great ad, and obviously an interesting message and very timely. And similarly, they got crazy backlash. I mean, it was great in that it brought a lot of conversation, but there were plenty of men that had that exact same response, where they just went nuts over the idea that anyone was sort of, I guess, criticizing what they perceived as masculinity when it wasn't intended to be the case.
I've talked to a lot of these guys that are getting offended by this, because I'm very curious about this whole thing, right? It's like, what the hell riled you up so much? And, you think like in nature, wolf is peeing on trees to mark territory, and then another wolf comes in, and then, the battle line is where that territory is in dispute, right? And a lot of these guys feel like if they give an inch, they're going to lose it all. And they feel like, they have some sort of advantage that's unspoken, and they feel like, it's a slippery slope. Like, now what? Am I going to have to wash the dishes? And it's just, I've had all kinds of conversations, you know what I mean? Where it's just like, wow, dude, I don't know how you and your wife coexist, because that seems kind of unfair. Right. But it's like, I can't give an inch, because then it's all over. And it's a really interesting kind of psychological phenomenon, right? Where, I mean, I don't know, maybe we're seeing it on the borders of, southern border of America. We're seeing a lot of this kind of polarized thinking, where people are digging in because if they're afraid if they concede a little, they're going to concede it all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really a crazy time right now in all respects, because it feels like there's a power struggle going on, which I wish everyone were just on the same side of. I think that would be the win, is if people didn't feel that there was something to lose, but that we all universally had something to gain, that would be the win. And that's certainly how we perceive it, which is that if women are able to step into their power, that's not at the expense of men. That should be in support of men, and societally we will all benefit. I mean, we want men to step into their power too. This isn't a conversation just for women. And we're saying that without being able to embrace a spectrum of emotions and sort of behavioral approaches, then you're really never going to step into your power, because your dimensions are so limited. And so I think that it's interesting. I mean, I think you're completely right. That's where that's the source of this fear that is unfounded. I mean, I wish there was more of a feeling, again, across the board, that we can all win, and that there's an infinite power source. It shouldn't be a power struggle. It's how do we work together to for everyone to be elevated. I've never felt so clear that there was room for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the middle, there's plenty of room for rational dialogue, right? But a lot of these guys, they're the archetype they point to is like the angry, frothing at the mouth, kind of stereotypical feminist that wants to chop his head off, right? And
Mm-hmm,
you're like, yeah,
mm-hmm,
that's not necessarily like everyone like goes to the polls and goes completely, they freak out and then they say, well, no way, like if
mm-hmm,
she's coming for me, I'm out, and you're like, come on. I'm talking to Amy Stanton right now, and that's not what she's saying,
mm-hmm.
right? Like
Yeah.
there's room in the middle for us all to have a dialogue, but people on the polarity, they're not thinking rationally, right? They're trying to conserve what they have. I mean, for men, I mean, and this is trite, but like it's just like, okay, well, I have some sort of advantage. Why would I give up that advantage right now, culturally? Like it's the guy show, it's the this,
Yeah.
it's the that, and they feel defensive over it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, it's one of the reasons we actually were excited to have a new conversation around femininity. And both Catherine and I are feminists, yes. And we certainly do a lot of work for women and to elevate women. But when push comes to shove, each of us would define femininity in our own ways. And my version is, how do I bring more softness and grace to situations, even tricky ones,
Mm,
which is literally the opposite of the image that you just painted that these guys are afraid of,
right,
So that's
right.
the irony of it all in some ways.
Yeah, it's disarming, right? To say that, and that's frankly why like we're having this conversation is there's a rational, wonderful conversation about how to meet in the middle. I was thinking about this morning actually, knowing that we're going to be on later today. South Africa had a really interesting process called the Truth and Reconciliation process. That basically said, like when they abolished apartheid and they started to kind of reallocate power and the ANC had won, and it was just basically going to be a bunch of like formerly repressed black people now running the country, and everyone's like, listen, if we don't do this right, they're just going to roll out the guillotines and all the white heads are going to roll, and there's going to be a disaster. And so
Mm.
they created this really interesting truth and reconciliation process where they had these kind of like open courts where people would talk about their grievances and heal the grievances, and it really brought the country together.
Mm.
And they've had all kinds of problems since, but it didn't turn into a complete civil war or genocide. Like it was actually hailed as a tremendous success, right? Because it opened up dialogue and it opened up just something that space that made it safe to say things, and it made it safe to to have grievances, and really find a new way of being. And I think without something like that, without some sort of like safe harbor for this conversation to happen, guys are going to dig their heels in and say this is how we do things here, and then it just becomes this combative, polarized world that you see reflected in our freaking news every day, right?
It's so true. And I hope that's the kind of conversation we can have, is one that allows for us to really work through these things together. It's been definitely, that was the goal from the beginning, is to start a conversation, open people's eyes to a new way of thinking about this, and really make it about every one of us ourselves, not, again, there's the fight for equal rights that's going on, and fine, that's that is what it is, but on a personal level, how do each of us show up as our best? How do we allow ourselves to free some of these things that we may have been repressing consciously, unconsciously, in a way that allows us to live our best lives? And that's, I think, again, it's really, in some ways, I watch people's faces, of course, when I start talking about this, and men in particular, like, it is, the word feminism is a hot button, and femininity is close enough to it that I think sometimes it's presumed that that's what we're talking about, and they
Right.
can go hand in hand. But I really think this is more of a personal exploration around, let's reevaluate some of the things that we've taken for granted about the way we have to operate in our day to day, and see if there's a better way that's healthier and happier and allows us to be actually even more effective in the way we operate. And I've definitely found that to be the case. I mean, I now still, it's a practice, of course. It's not something that that is going to be solved or resolved. But for me, one of the things I do, especially in tough situations now, is I will literally, before, let's say I had to let someone go a few weeks ago, which is of all things in the world that I hate, probably in the top 10. And I was dreading it so much. And I just had to have a moment with myself where I said, okay, all I can hope for this situation is that I bring love and softness and grace to this conversation. And if I can do that, then I've succeeded. And that's really the mentality. And by the way, I'm not succeeding every time. I still will have a call or a meeting or something where I'm like, why did I get so worked up? And instead of judging myself and going, oh, you're so emotional, I can then take a step back and go, okay, I got emotional. What was it that caused that? Were there good parts of it? I.e., the person on the other side of the table goes, oh, Amy really cares about this. And were there negative repercussions? Oh, Amy got too worked up about it. Okay, fine. Now we can look at those and sort of just accept them for what they are and move on, and maybe we do it differently the next time. But, so much of this is like allowing us as humans to be human.
Yeah, but I mean, you get into corporate structure, and then the question is, what would HR say, right? And it's just like there's all these like really weird, kind of inhumane, unnatural rules and regulations and things you should and
Yes.
shouldn't say as a human in the corporate structure. And it's skewed masculine in a lot of ways, right?
Mm.
But it really does kind of like limit the capacity of you to fully emote and kind of be a human in that moment. Which
Mm-hmm.
makes it yucky. Like I've had to let people go, and it's just like, okay, what am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? Don't give them a
Mm-hmm.
hug. It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh man, come on, right? Like, but it's just like, well, what do you want to get sued, right? And so
Right.
the system is also that way. It makes it hard.
It's so true. And obviously, each thing is its own specific example, but one that I do often talk about because I think it's an interesting and in some cases perceived as extreme example is crying. So I think universally we would all agree that crying is not welcome in the workplace. And that's not an HR issue. It's more of a just not, it's more of a universally I think we perceive that if someone cries in the workplace, it's not going to work to their advantage. And
Sure. Yeah, you're seen as unstable at best.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But what? First of all, I think we can all agree that there was never in the history of time a day when someone woke up in the morning and said, "I hope I burst into tears in my boss's office today." So what actually happened was there was a human moment. That person was human because, and yes, it was a loss of control. And by the way, being human is okay. The real issue is around how the crying is handled and the response to the crying. So, what we often do when we burst into tears in an inappropriate situation or what we perceive to be inappropriate is we flip out, we immediately latch on to the, oh my God, what is going to happen to me next? I'm so embarrassed. This person thinks less of me. We run to the bathroom or we panic in the moment, whatever the circumstances are. It's always a negative one. So what if we turn that on its head? What if we actually lean into it and we, instead of flipping out over it, we go, okay, what if I'm able to actually use this moment as a way to connect with the person on the other side of the table? What if I, instead of backing away from it, can go, the reason I'm getting emotional right now is because I care so much about this job. The reason I'm getting emotional right now is because I thought I was going to get a raise today, and instead you're giving me all this constructive feedback that I didn't even know I needed. And so suddenly you're able to communicate to the person sitting there instead of it being a situation where both people walk the other way feeling misunderstood and feel a huge amount of angst. And, by the way, and I had these two very powerful men that I worked for when I was running the marketing and PR for New York's Olympic bid. And one came from the banking world and one came from politics. And they were super aggressive, assertive, sometimes yellers. And I loved it because I loved how direct they were. I loved that I always knew where things stood. I loved that I didn't have to wonder what was going on in their heads. And yet I was also still myself. So because of the sort of heated moments that inevitably arose, since it was a pretty intense experience all around, I would cry. Not all the time, but definitely enough times. And I think in the beginning it was a little bit of a shock to them because they come from environments where no one cried. They were mostly surrounded by men, and they definitely weren't surrounded by criers. And what was interesting, I'd say, on both sides of it is we really came to this middle ground where it was never a problem. It's like it's not like we'd sit there and fixate on the fact that I was crying or that we'd have to stop what we were talking about. It just would be part of what was happening. And I recently, they were kind enough to host an event for me around the book launch. And I brought this specific thing up, of course, because since I even mentioned them in the book, and Dan he said, I never, whenever you cried, I never questioned where it was coming from. I knew it was because you were so passionate about what you were doing. I knew it was because you cared. And for me, that was meaningful. So I think it's a great example of where I wouldn't say crying is a good thing or something that I would choose to do. But maybe actually it was. Maybe it was what brought us closer together.
It was real. I mean, in Chinese medicine, there's a pathological element. When your mental element is out, they say the pathological emotion is weeping too much. So the question is, what's weeping too much? I mean, if your dog died today, should you be crying? Absolutely. Tomorrow, maybe another week. But if you're crying 2 years after your dog died, maybe it's a little off, right? And so there's a spectrum of what's like a kind of appropriate emotive force. In relation to things. And in my experience, I mean, most of the people in the business world have an emotional IQ of like a roly-poly. You know what I mean? So for you to cry in front of someone who just doesn't have the emotional capacity to have, basically faced any of their own stuff, it's so uncomfortable, right? And that raw, pure emotion is just, it brings a lot of discomfort in people that haven't faced any of their stuff. And that, unfortunately, is the tinderbox of the society we live in. It's just a bunch of repressed people who have no friends and are lonely despite being surrounded by people, right?
I love how you always keep it real, Pedram. I love it.
It's hard. I used to do a lot of corporate wellness, and coming from the wild world of wellness, going into some of these boxes with all these like humans pretending to be robots, there was just so much dissonance, right? And there was zero kind of feminine quality. There was zero like hangout energy, right? It was all like, I should be doing something right now, right? And to your point, like it was just overly masculine in traits that made it just really uncomfortable. And you could tell everyone in there was paying the price. Their creativity was stifled. Everything was stifled. Obviously, they called me in for help, yet they couldn't hear what I was saying because they couldn't slow down to even think about it.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's funny when it's such a foreign conversation because to me, again, a lot of this is intuitive. I've definitely been deep in it, and I am fortunate enough to run my own business where I can actually create a culture that welcomes these things, and I can even continue to embrace it further now that I've done this exploration and continue to. But what I find fascinating is to your point, this sort of extreme opposite that is so many parts of the world. We wrote one of the chapters around intuition and how important it is, and how, again, it's picking up real information. It shouldn't be dismissed as woo. It is actually, in addition to data points, can be the most valuable thing you have. It's a very deep power. And one of my dear friends and clients yesterday told me that one of her coworkers at one point literally said, "No one at this company cares about your intuition." And I thought, or values your intuition. I was like, wow, that's incredible. That's incredible.
Was this a higher up or a peer?
I think he was higher up than she was, but at the end of the day, I mean,
ouch.
I feel like that's not appropriate, period. But regardless, I think he was speaking the truth. That's the scariest part of the whole thing.
Right. Well, no, it's a question of whether he's questioning, like, the madness of the housing. Like, these guys are all fucked up and no one gives a shit. And I
Mm.
and I'm in it with you versus,
Oh, no, the latter.
yeah,
The latter.
the latter. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, he was basically rejecting an idea. I mean, she was making a strong case for a
Oof.
decision, and she had made the case, and then on top of it said, "I have basically her intuition was the decision maker, not instead of the data
Yeah.
points." And he said, "No one in this company values your intuition." This is really shocking.
Right.
So thankfully, I've never heard anything like that personally, but I will say, I mean, just knowing that people say things like that or even think things like that is part of why it's so important to have this conversation.
I guarantee you my listeners have. I mean, there's a lot of dog shit out in this world. There are a lot of really, really nasty people that people are forced to work with. And it feels like a prison. And people just are like biting their upper lip and, taking drugs or doing whatever they can do to tolerate the a-holes that they're at work with sometimes. And then they go home and do all these things like yoga to like kind of, breathe it off.
Mm.
But the source of the infection is a toxic mentality at work and someone who's just super uncool, right? And there's a lot more of that than people are willing to kind of talk about because they don't want to get fired. You know what I mean? Like everyone, they like if I were to take anonymous callers, the phones would light up. You know what I mean?
Well, it goes back to what you're saying, which is that a lot of this stuff is just presumed as the way it has to be. Again, part of the reason we wrote this book. There's without anyone sort of taking a step back and going, wait a minute, this is not right. And we're all playing to the system that actually can change. And we need to be part of that change. Without that, it will stay like this and we will continue to see bigger and bigger problems as a result. So, what's exciting is thinking about, again, even incremental shifts and so much of this is nuanced and we all have the ability to make those changes within our world. And I mean, just using the intuition example, I have employees that come into my office all day, every day, and they say, what should I do about this? What should I do about that? And knowing that they've evaluated the facts, I will then say, what does your gut tell you? And more times than not, their gut is totally aligned with mine. So even just creating opportunities like that, where we are in subtle ways starting to reinforce a different behavior, is really, it can make the difference.
The book is called The Feminine Revolution. I highly recommend it, not just for our women listeners, right? Everybody, because it's a conversation that we all need to have, and it's a real one that brings us all to the middle and helps us kind of think about how we think. And I think that we're at a time in our history where we have to start challenging the operating system. Right, our operating system is leading us to climate change and all sorts of kind of messed up things on the planet. And so if we don't start questioning how we operate, and I got a 3-year-old daughter, and I look at some of the like kind of stereotypical things that like my dad said to my sister, and I just cringe. I'm like, wow, he forgive him for he did not know, right? But we at this point, I have a chance in my generation to correct this and empower this young girl to not go into her life with any of these belief systems and to be, completely, absolved of this sin, right? And so if we don't do this now, then, how many more generations are we going to perpetuate it?
It's so true. And people ask me often, what do you hope the results of this will be? And I say someday when I hope to have a daughter and someone tells her she's being too sensitive, I hope she can say, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Thanks for doing this. This is not an easy subject. I'm sure it's been, you've had some hard conversations along the way. And, look, we got to talk about it. And a lot of times people, who bring up things that people don't necessarily want to talk about, at least my gender, right? It makes it an uphill battle. And that's why it's an important conversation, doubly.
Yeah, well, it's not only your gender. Even as we were selling the book, It was interesting. There was one situation where one of the publishers that we had great talks with, and I was I really actually thought that might have been who we were going to end up with. We ended up with Seal Press, and it was wonderful, and it was exactly as it was meant to be. But another publisher at the 11th hour had a change of heart and said, you know what, honestly, I feel uncomfortable with this because I feel like we shouldn't be reinforcing labels that have historically existed, because we should be moving towards a world without labels. And Catherine and I felt that was just, it was an example of a strong feminist having this visceral response to the word femininity because it makes her uncomfortable. Because the fact is, these stereotypes and labels, they exist. If we don't break them down, if we don't look at them, we're just looking the other way. And that is not an option. So nothing will ever change unless we actually start to reframe these ideas and start to make these qualities not only acceptable, but actually welcomed and embraced. And so it was interesting. I mean, just knowing that one of the things I always ask whenever I talk to groups of women is, what's your first feeling around the word femininity? What's your visceral response to it? Because a lot of women feel uncomfortable with it. Of course, there's some women who are like, oh, it's all the good parts of being a woman. Great. That may be true. But when we dig deeper and people start to explore the ways in which they've been shamed or feeling shame or holding things back because they felt that was needed, it's a much more complicated conversation. And realizing that, again, women are as much a part of the challenge as men are, because if we aren't able to kind of allow for these things in ourselves, then there will never be a shift.
Amen. Well, ladies, you heard her. Everyone's got to get to work on this one. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be unfun, right? It's just, it's a conversation around every dinner table that can help us be better, right? Better all around.
It's totally fun. I mean, this exploration is great. We have a chapter around flirting, which is not just around the idea of flirting for the purpose of attracting a mate, but it's also about bringing a more flirtatious way of living into your day to day. So bringing a lightness and ease in challenging or not so challenging situations. And we could probably all think of someone that we know who just has a light, flirtatious way of living in the world. And I always feel like those people are the happiest. And so that is fun. It's fun. I mean, if people say to me, which of these qualities do you feel like you need to work on? And that's one of the ones I'm working on, is entering the day-to-day with a more flirtatious way of being. And some days I'm succeeding, other days not so much, but that's part of the practice.
That's it. So my 5-year-old son was homesick today, and he just woke up from his nap and walked into the room I've been hiding in, and I'm gonna kiss his face. His daddies do that.
Excellent.
Awesome. So listen, get the book and read the book. Join the conversation. Amy, always a pleasure. Can't wait to see you next time I do. And where's the best place for them to get the book? I mean, it's obviously on online platforms, but what's best? Yeah,
it's
what's
everywhere.
Best for your?
Yeah, I mean, anywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. We also have a website, femininerevolutionbook.com, if you want more information. And then you also can follow me or find me at Amy K. Stanton on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc.
Awesome. Love you. Great
to hear your voice. Thank you. It's such a treat.
Keep it up. It's a treat hanging out with you every time. So keep it up. All right, folks, I'll see you next time. See you when I do another podcast. And be well. And Urban Monk is going Mountain Monk for the next couple of years at least. So, and Amy's going to come visit because she loves that.
Yeah, I want in on that for sure.
Yep. Come play. All right, folks, I'll see you next time.